The future of open source software. What was your idea around that, Paul?
Well, I think as you highlighted in the review, we've talked about open source a number of times, and with all the changes that have happened at places like Red Hat and others, what is the future for it? Is it a sustainable model? And therefore, I suppose I come at it from the point of view that says most enterprises that you talk to, love the idea of open source from a development point of view, from a speed point of view, from a sort of new ideas, and from the way it could deliver some real advantages for them, both financial, but also in terms of business positioning. But I've always been concerned about the support issues. And so I sort of dug a little deeper into where I thought that was going. And the one that really struck me, was various discussions going on around, the maintenance of existing code base. Interestingly, just as an aside on that, I'm reading a MIT Technology Review, Massachusetts Institute of Technology review paper that said, amazingly, 96% of all code bases incorporate open source software. Now, there might be very small bits of open source software in a wider base, so it's not necessarily 96% of all systems out there are open source based. But clearly, from the perspective of development of software, open source has been a boon to business and industry in general, and has got a future. But the real concern comes with the maintenance of those code bases, that are the open source code bases, and they're relying very heavily on volunteers, if you like, to actually keep these code bases running. And that's where I see a real risk in the future, is that, as these people, who are trying to maintain these code bases, get tired or disillusioned or just need money somehow, there's a threat to the independence of those code bases, I think. And that would be a concern of mine. It'd be interesting to get your take on that. And because I think, for all the sort of ideas of Richard Stallman when he set up, the open, what was it called? The Free Software Foundation back in 1983. That sort of wonderful sort of utopian view of being able to, develop and share everything freely, hasn't really materialized quite the way he might have thought. I mean, it's still there, and he's still heavily involved with the Free Software Foundation. But the reality is, if you look at the Red Hats of this world and and everybody else, is that it's gone down a slightly different route that has had to pay some doff its cap, if you like, to the needs of the enterprise that's out there, but has also become caught up in major vendor politics. And I think that's always going to be an issue.
Yeah, I would love to find out whether the recent changes, the recent issues and concerns that we've had, and as you said, we have covered this a number of times, and we'll continue to cover it on the channel. Like I said, we're into some panels and things like that in the future as well. I'm wondering whether that's because of not the status quo that we had before. So you had like an open source version of something, and you had an enterprise version of something. If you didn't want to pay for the enterprise, or none of the features of the enterprise were useful to you, just use the open source version, and then it was up to you how to get support and support it yourself and maintain and whatever. But if you wanted, as you said, the support and the kind of have that sort of sustainability model, then you'd go, and as well as the features, the extra features, then you'd go for an enterprise version. You get your subscription for that, and you'd be able to do that. But I'm wondering whether the recent changes are a lot more around this perpetual, we must make more money, we must report better results quarter by quarter. So how can we squeeze the business, the sector, the customers, that we have in order to be able to do that? Oh, I tell you what, I got a great idea. Let's change our license, right? And forget everybody else. Let's forget that this is supposed to be a participation, a community, people who are enthusiastic, as you said, about, maintaining code and volunteering their time and so on. Let's just turn it into a pure greed thing where we have to hit our targets and report every quarter because we have a number of investors who, and Wall Street and, and whoever is actually expecting us to, to achieve those targets, targets quarter by quarter. So I'd love to know if there is a correlation there to what I'm kind of thinking in these more recent, decisions that have been made by the likes of, Red Hat and HashiCorp and, and so on. There's a number of those, not just picking on those names. We did, like I said, I think I covered this a while back, and we mentioned a lot more names than that.
Yeah, I did. Yes is the answer, and very short.
Very simple. Yes, Richard.
Yes, whether you want to use the term greed or but there was one word you used in there which I thought was sort of quite interesting. Is we've got to meet the requirements of our investors.
Yeah.
But when you look at, particularly from a startup perspective, this, how on earth, they have to sort of portray how they're going to get a return for the people who are investing in them. And I think it's, there are so many different things coming along for people to put their money into that they're having to take, so startups different from the existing Red Hat, HashiCorp and all those, because I think that's a slightly different thing. But from a startup perspective, there's the challenge of getting the money in the first place. I think from an enterprise perspective, in terms of Red Hat, HashiCorp and others becoming enterprises themselves, enterprise vendors and vendors, large companies in their own right. Yes, they do have a whole series of people they have to pander to, is the only way you can describe it. And there is very little long-term thinking within Wall Street financial services environment, and let's face it, that is the predominant financial environment that all these companies have to live in. It's a very quarter by quarter focused, and so they have to find different ways of keeping their stock price up, their revenues up, all the things, and they will do virtually anything to make that happen in the short term. And so so yes, you can call that greed. You can call it, but I call it is the natural scheme of things at the moment, is that it's really difficult to fight that.
Yeah, it's capitalism, basically.
Yeah, and capitalism works for the most part.
Yes.
It's that when you heard my sort of, for the most part, it's how you deal with that bit that is, where you actually need to bring it to heal a little bit without, in fact, stopping the development of new ideas.
Yeah, and I think there are other factors as well, like acquisitions, for example. It's a large company acquiring a smaller company, but it's not going to acquire it until the smaller company makes a few changes here and there to its policy and its strategy and its licensing schemes and so on, in order to make it, shall we say, more attractive, to the acquirer. Right?
Yeah.
And then once that's done, or that's part of the agreement, then the license changes, and you go from a XYZ license to a subscription license, as Broadcom has done to VMware, or Red Hat has stopped, making its source code available and only upstream to one project, and basically screwed everybody else, in that space who was using it. And then you have projects forking and various other different distributions appearing on the market. HashiCorp, again, has not done itself any favors recently. With the Terraform license as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. Again, you bring up the term, it forks, and it does regularly, because obviously the groups of people who are trying to maintain what they see as the integrity of the original open source idea want to go off their own route. But the reality is, of course, it then fragments and fractures, into bits as well.
Yeah.
So it's a real challenge. I mean, I'd love to think that we could all, in a utopian world, do stuff for nothing and sort of share everything in this sort of wonderful utopian way. It doesn't work like that, and it's so I suppose as a getting older and more cynical, you sort of say, well, that is the nature of things, and it's how you sort of navigate your way through that. And how many, if you just look at the way in which a few individuals have taken over the IT world, most people don't have the long-term focus or ability to keep it going. At some time, when enough money is waved in front of their face, they'll do all sorts of things that we don't necessarily like, because they go, well, I've worked all my life, haven't I? I mean, the Linus Torvalds of this world are few and far between.
Yes.
Most people will say, I'll take the gold now, please.
Yeah, and most of them are actually driving their startup for that to happen. They're kind of ripening, themselves for.
There are a lot that do that. I mean, but there are a lot that have got an idea. They want to change the world. They want to change the way things happen. But then, the reality of, Maslow's hierarchy of needs comes to play, and they have to feed the family.
Yeah. Have to put food on the table. Indeed. Okay. And the other aspect of it, I think, that I slightly wanted to very briefly wanted to touch on was the relevance of open source in the AI world. So apart from the code gen kind of the aspect of it, which we won't probably go into today, just, I think AI, for me, just doesn't really need open source. I'm just seeing a lot of pure sheer desperation from the open source community trying to remain relevant in that AI space. I think I've said to you before offline on a number of conversations that AI is really an HPC, it's a high performance computing workload, and HPC, as we all know, is best run when it's as close to the bare metal as possible. But when you start introducing hypervisors and VMs or full fat operating systems or orchestrators and containers, you're adding to those unnecessary layers to that software stack. And that can all introduce latency and, more maintenance and blah, blah, blah. So I'm seeing a lot of kind of the open source community trying to, extend its arms and embrace or grab AI and saying, oh, look, we can run this model now. I've put it in Kubernetes, or, I've put everything in a Docker containers, or I'm using XYZ database with it. And it's like, yeah, that's all great, but does it really need that? Do we really need that?
But again, you're coming back to, what's the underlying code? The underlying code quite often are algorithms, certainly currently. I mean, when we get more deeply into neural networks and inference systems, then, I'll stop talking because I don't really understand what's going on there. But a lot of the early AI, machine learning early AI is based on algorithms.
Yeah.
Are freely available. The algorithms are not, no longer sort of proprietary information. So you could argue that sense, and that therefore you can develop code around that to see how those algorithms work. I agree with you that the actual workload is such an HPC environment that you don't want to create too much of a stack in between the hard, the actual bare metal and the application. But the application could be open source. But we've had different discussions around, actually, there's such a commercial advantage that people are going to, it's like, in a big exam where you also make sure nobody's looking over your shoulder to copy your answers. It's that sort of world at the moment. So I think, yes, there's a challenge. Like anything else, and this is, purists won't like this, we live in a hybrid world. We really do live in a world where there's lots of old stuff, lots of new stuff, and having to make everything work together. means, pragmatically, you end up with a hybrid type environment. And I think this is no different. I think, the idea of open source software development won't go away. And I think that's secure. How it's maintained and how it's licensed ultimately to make money, and how you then bring in, or maintain a sort of, a community-like community-like structure is the difficult one. But if 96% of all code bases, incorporate open source software, as MIT are suggesting, it ain't going away anytime soon.
Yeah, but there's also a difference, I think. There needs to be a distinction between whether open source software is relevant to AI from whether AI should be open sourced. So AI running for me does not need open source in order to run. Like I said earlier, it's an HPC workload. It needs to sit as close to the hardware as possible. And if that's a proprietary application like OpenAI's models, so be it. OpenAI doesn't care about open sourcing its models, and it shouldn't care about that. That's its, its proprietary solution. That's its proprietary IP. The other side of that is, should AI be open source? So when somebody comes up with a fantastic new, foundational model or something, should that be open sourced? And I think that's a different topic. And unfortunately, we won't be discussing that today. That's something we can pick up on in the future. And I think that's actually probably another panel discussion that I'm trying to put together. So maybe we will revisit that. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support me. You may also want to check out some of the other videos on this channel. Bye for now.